Few video game series have the legacy that Castlevania has. Over 30 years and more than 20 games released in that time, players have had more than enough opportunity to step up and defeat Dracula. Critically, the series has seen some turbulence throughout its existence, but the series' impact on video games as a whole is undeniable. While Symphony of the Night might be the most widely acknowledged for its influence on exploratory aspects, the first game's bite marks still attract would-be vampire hunters to adorn Simon Belmont's boots. Castlevania released on the NES in 1986 and has earned itself a great degree of infamy in that time. While the game was one of the few generous enough to provide significant checkpoints and featured an incredible array of weapons to defeat enemies with, Castlevania's difficulty is still the game's most discussed aspect. Enemies are positioned in devious locations or move in ways that are tough to predict, and the player is liable to be killed by most adversaries they must face. When hit, Simon is launched backward with such diabolical force that he seems magnetically attracted to open pits that spell instant death. The bosses are similarly unforgiving and can quickly deplete the player's life while barely taking hits themselves. How the game is controlled also contributes to the fiendish reputation. The NES controller has very few buttons, and when not paused, Castlevania only ever makes use of the D-pad and 2 other buttons. Simon moves at a brisk pace, and while on the ground is able to crouch down to duck under danger. Simon's jumping abilities are rather suspect, however. When standing still, Simon will jump straight up and fall down to where he started. It isn't possible to influence his trajectory while Simon is airborne. Then, when Simon is moving, a jump will cause him to leap into an arcing motion that is similarly non-influenceable. If the player jumps, there is no going back, so they'd better be certain they can hit their target before the button is pressed. Missing a platform will likely result in death. Jumping toward an enemy will presumably end with Simon taking damage. But since the arc is always the same, with practice, the player can intuit where they will land. The second button engages the whip, which Simon must pull back in order to deal damage, much like how a real whip isn't dangerous until the full motion is completed. This delay can result in the player taking damage, since they are unable to destroy incoming projectiles or dispatch an enemy. Much like the jump arcs, this delay can also be intuited, and the combination of these two things allows for a lot of player skill expression. Using a combination of up and attack to use the secondary weapon is absolutely a symptom of the NES hardware limitations, but adapting to this is something the player must do in order to succeed. When compared to modern games, these controls should be a detractor. The response time would be panned by critics as control schemes become more and more homogenized, but for Castlevania, the player's capabilities are put to the test when simply moving Simon through the world. Then, the enemies are positioned in such a way that thoughtlessness in approaching them is bound to lead to damage or death. And while death resetting the player to the last door they walk through is similar to how checkpoint systems are implemented in modern games, Castlevania still features a lives mechanic, which upon losing all of those lives, forces the player to restart the entire level. The levels aren't excessively long, but since the player cannot save at any point, they must clear the entire game in a single sitting. Any setback feels crippling. My final playthrough took almost 2 hours from entering the castle to defeating Dracula. But because of the lack of saves, I spent just less than 7 hours total playing Castlevania. Some modern games, particularly indie games, are about as long as this. And despite the player having to repeat previous content between play sessions, it doesn't feel padded out. With experience, I was able to get through the first 4 levels in around 30 minutes, and I was even using techniques I found myself to skip unnecessary rooms. The bosses are simplistic on paper, but when encountered, are as complex as some modern boss battles, without as many flashy visuals. When a modern boss is less engaging than the Frankenstein's monster boss from Castlevania, there is a clear failure on the modern designer's product. They could play Castlevania today and make adjustments so their bosses build from already established success. It may seem unfair to make that assessment, but there are large swathes of the video game industry that wear their Castlevania influence for all to see. Massively popular franchises like Dark Souls and newly emerging IPs like the Bloodstained series have their genesis firmly planted on Castlevania's shoulders. The indie scene is especially fond of Castlevania, and many homages have been released throughout the years. Simon Belmont is even popular enough to appear in Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Crossover fighting game. Many of those players are probably going to be unfamiliar with Simon Belmont, as his last protagonist role was in 1991's Super Castlevania 4. And while Simon's new look is modern and in a resolution that lifts him beyond a collection of squares, it is a little bland. Not to say that Simon wasn't bland looking in Castlevania. Originally, he was orange. Fortunately, Simon's stride was characterful enough to prevent him from being uninteresting to look at. And since Castlevania featured so many dark or blue backgrounds, the orange is a perfect choice for visual clarity. This footage has been recorded from original hardware and upscaled to an HDMI signal so that my capture card could read it. So as far as the overall visuals go, for an NES game, there isn't an awful lot better, but I personally don't find it to be anything spectacular. The primary objective of every sprite in the game is to be readable, and there were never instances where I was unable to distinguish a sprite from the background. So Castlevania has succeeded in that, but the primary triumph is the backgrounds. There is a lot being done with very little here. For such a tiny file size, the developers managed to squeeze a lot of different distinctive environments in, and each with their own musical accompaniment. Castlevania music has always been fantastic, and I found some familiar tracks while playing through this game. The sound effects are mostly acceptable, but there's one sound that really hurts to listen to. Fortunately, it doesn't come up too often. In terms of presentation hurdles to overcome, the issues aren't enough to spoil the experience, so long as being an older game isn't an issue. For any tentative or undecided players, if you play video games to complete a satisfying challenge, or you have some masochistic tendencies, then Castlevania will provide. It scratches that same itch that recent From Software games and classic shoot-'em-up games associate. There are enough checkpoints for Castlevania to be a relatively comfortable playthrough, so long as you don't abuse save states if you're emulating. The game is purposely designed around completing it in a single sitting, although I would just start from the beginning if I couldn't finish it on the first attempt. There are many examples of outstanding game design to be gleaned from Castlevania, and I believe that its age only adds to the prestige of being able to create something so well refined, so close to the start of home video games. Design aspects in games influenced by Castlevania will become more apparent once the player has that knowledge. It'll be like making the connection between Nesquik cereal and rabbits. It's a classic for a reason. Castlevania has a lot of excellent aspects hidden within it, and the game won't hand them over if you ask nicely. Develop the skill, learn the timings, and memorize boss behavior, and Dracula's castle will come tumbling down. Simon isn't cursed yet. I'll be taking a step into the shadows next time. entering a city many else have been before, but I have yet to go and clear my name. I hope you'll support me.